It was meant to be a Merry Christmas. Instead, it was forgotten in grief. Welcome to Phantom Mystery. I am your host, Edmund Cross. Drop a comment with your location. Your voices make this community thrive. Hearing from you all makes this journey even more special. Now the case. It was the sort of winter's day that might have been painted in a child's picture book. Frosted hedgerows glittering, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, and the air filled with the faint scent of pine and roasted chestnuts. St. Mary Mead was preparing itself for Christmas with a cheer that only a small English village could muster. In the church hall, the vicar's wife was arranging a festive bazaar. At the Green Man, carolers rehearsed merrily in exchange for mulled wine. And in nearly every cottage, one could glimpse candles in windows and wreaths hung neatly on polished doors. At the heart of it all, of course, was the annual Christmas Eve gathering at the Bantry residence. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, well known for their generous hospitality, had sent invitations to practically everyone of note in the village. Even those who were not especially fond of each other could not resist the opportunity to gather under the Bantry's glittering chandeliers, sip sherry, and exchange tidbits of gossip while admiring the great Christmas tree brought in from the estate's parkland. Among the guests, quietly knitting in her customary unobtrusive fashion, sat Miss Jane Marple. With her pale eyes twinkling behind her spectacles, she seemed quite at home in the bustle of holiday cheer. To anyone who glanced at her, she was the picture of elderly gentility, harmless and altogether ordinary. Yet, as many in St. Mary Mead could have attested, Miss Marple's mild manner belied a mind sharper than any blade. She observed, she listened, and she remembered. It was just as the clock in the Bantry drawing-room struck 8 that the first ripple of disquiet disturbed the festive air. Mrs. Leslie Harrington, newly arrived in the village, glamorous in her fur stole and pearl earrings, gave a startled cry and clutched at her glass of wine, spilling it across the polished parquet floor. All heads turned as she staggered, her expression frozen in sudden horror. Within moments she collapsed lifeless onto the carpet beside the roaring fire. The room fell into stunned silence. Colonel Bantry barked an order for someone to fetch Dr. Haydock at once, while Mrs. Bantry knelt beside the fallen woman, calling her name in vain. A few guests gasped. Others stood rooted in shock. And in one shadowed corner, Miss Marple's knitting needles paused only for a fraction of a second. Her gaze, calm and searching, moved from the lifeless body to the faces around her. The shock, the fear, the too quick attempts at composure. It was supposed to be Christmas Eve, a night of warmth and laughter. Instead, the Bantry's drawing-room had become the scene of a sudden and dreadful death. No one yet dared call it murder, though already the thought flickered unspoken in many minds. Later, long after Dr. Haydock had declared Mrs. Harrington gone, the whispers began. "Too much wine," suggested Mrs. Price Ridley with grim certainty. "Her heart, poor dear," muttered another, but others were less convinced. After all, Mrs. Harrington had been in the prime of life, and there had been something unnervingly deliberate in the way her hand had jerked before she fell. As the guests were ushered into the cold night, their murmurs trailing into the frosty air, Miss Marple lingered just a moment longer by the window. Outside, the snow had begun to fall softly, muffling the village in a pristine silence. She pressed her lips together, thoughtful, for while the others spoke of hearts and accidents, she could not ignore the unmistakable flicker she had seen in Mrs. Harrington's eyes, an expression not of weakness, but of dawning realization. A look that spoke unmistakably of sudden betrayal. Snow fell through the night, smoothing lanes and hedgerows until St. Mary Mead looked freshly laundered. By morning the village brightness had a brittle edge. Curtains were whisked back. The bell above Mr. Petherick's shop rang as if nerves tugged the string. At the post office a thin queue advanced on whispers, and a constable trudged by with his notebook, clasped like a hot water bottle. Christmas or no Christmas, a death in a drawing-room would not be decent enough to wait. Christmas lights winked along the green, cheerful as ever. But conversation kept circling back to the Bantrys' drawing room that night. In the High Street, Mrs. Price Ridley announced that Mrs. Harrington had always looked over-excitable. Miss Hartnell said poison was a modern convenience. At the Green Man, Mr. Archer polished glasses and told the baker's boy that Providence disliked performances. Everyone agreed the Bantrys were unlucky again. Facts, however, were sparse. Dr. Haydock, sharp with fatigue, admitted only that the death was sudden and inconsistent with natural collapse. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham with his capable bustle and tidy, impatient handwriting. He collected every glass and frowned at the decanters, as if they had plotted. He disliked interference. She, having slept poorly from thought rather than shock, accepted a boiled egg from Mary, and listened while the girl reported that the Bantrys' charwoman had told the fishmonger's boy there was a quarrel before dinner. "Which gentleman?" Miss Marple asked. Mary did not know. Only that Mrs. Bantry moved a place card, and the lady was angry. That image of a white card slid along a polished table occupied Miss Marple while she wound her wool. People shifted chairs for comfort and truth for policy. Toward mid-morning she stepped into the post office, where Miss Weatherby, precise and flurried, managed both Christmas and the nation's correspondence. The air smelled of damp coats and fur. "Registered letter for Mrs. Harrington yesterday," Miss Weatherby murmured from London, signed for at noon. Ethel took it up. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "People like surprises at Christmas, though surprises are seldom safe. Mr. Julian Godfrey," she added, "had telephoned Mrs. Harrington twice last week, which was unlike him. He preferred to call in person. On the green the carolers rehearsed steady enough." Griselda Clement, bright as a holly-berry, drew Miss Marple beneath the lich-gate. "It is ghastly, Jane," she said. Len quivers with helpfulness and Slack bars the door. "Have you heard?" Lionel Pike was seen walking with her. "Someone says she scolded him." "Dear Griselda," Miss Marple replied. "Earnest young men are often taken for secretive ones." She glanced toward the Green Man's window. One holly sprig hung upside down. "One can be careless with decorations," she observed, and Griselda laughed without knowing why the remark fell so neatly. Colonel Bantry called after luncheon to escort Miss Marple to Gossington Hall. Dolly, fortified by tea, received her and said she could not think how such a thing had happened here. A respectable party, games and crackers and syllabub, and then that dreadful collapse. Miss Marple made small soothing sounds and asked small questions. "Where did Mrs. Harrington sit?" "Near the fire at first. She was cold from the drive." "Did she know many people?" "Not well. She came in September. Took Ivy Cottage from Mr. Godfrey. A widow, American money, English taste. Looked straight at one. Men liked it. Women did not." Inspector Slack, encountering them in the hall, requested that they keep to the morning room. "We are taking statements," he said. "Doctor suggests poison. It is not the sherry. I have collected every glass. We shall get to the bottom of it." He gave Miss Marple a glance that bounced off her wool. "Best leave the sifting to those with sieves, eh?" "Quite," said Miss Marple. Polly Larch, borrowed from the kitchen, brought in extra cups. As she set down the tray, a paper scrap clung to her cuff. Miss Marple brushed it free and slipped it beside her handkerchief. It was the narrow end of a Christmas cracker motto, cheap purple ink, the words "best intentions" jagged where a tack had once held it. By late afternoon, the village drew its curtains. Snow feathered the hedges. At the Green Man, Lionel Pike sat with a soda water he did not drink, and the posture of a man rehearsing innocence. His intense look, which in choir practice meant zeal, now suggested concealment to those who wished it to. Tommy Legg, who sometimes played for him when lumbago visited, confided that Mrs. Harrington had called Mr. Pike a coward near the yew hedge. Whether he had heard truly or enjoyed the importance of saying so remained uncertain. At Ivy Cottage the police completed an initial search. Clara Briggs, the companion retained from London days, hovered with the air of a woman betrayed by disorder. "My mistress was exacting but generous," she told Slack. "A perfectionist, sir, but not unkind. Visitors had been few. Mr. Godfrey about the lease, a Mrs. Lydia Pike selling bazaar tickets, and a gentleman from town the day before yesterday. Dark coat, neat hat, soft voice." Clara had not caught the name. Letters from London came often. Some were returned unopened. She said this with a hint of significance and then coloured, as if significance itself were an indiscretion. The unknown gentleman acquired, as unknown gentlemen do, a raincoat, an accent, and 2 different hats before evening. Some declared he had kissed Mrs. Harrington's hand. Others preferred raised voices. Miss Marple, at her window with neglected knitting, considered the registered letter at noon, the motto about intentions and the upside-down holly. She considered, too, what she had noticed when the sherry was handed round. Mrs. Harrington lifted her glass, frowned very slightly, then, with the social deftness of a woman accustomed to managing occasions, set it down and took another from the tray. It had been done neatly. Most eyes had been on the carolers at the door. Miss Marple's had not. Colonel Melchett came late to the vicarage to compare notes with the Reverend Clement and his wife. He found Len grave, Griselda inquisitive, and Miss Marple interested in whether Mrs. Harrington had exchanged her seat when the crackers were brought. "I only thought," Miss Marple said, "that people sometimes move nearer the fire when there is a draught." Melchett promised to ask. At the door, Miss Marple remarked that one learns a great deal from how people hold a glass. "Oh," said Melchett. "And what habit betrayed Mrs. Harrington?" "It is too soon to say," Miss Marple replied. "Only that she faced a thing squarely, and someone punished her for it. St. Mary Mead, having talked itself hoarse, slept at last. In the quiet, small facts lay like crumbs on a white cloth. A quarrel near the yew hedge, a registered letter at noon, a place card moved, a motto pinned and torn away, a holly sprig upside down, and a glass that was not the one first chosen. No one yet knew which crumbs led to the kitchen and which into the snow." Miss Marple sat a while longer by her window. The snow went on with its impartial covering. In the morning the village would look clean and new again, and no one would remember where their own feet had been. But she would remember. It was, after all, her habit. Morning brought a deceptive calm, though the village buzzed beneath its frosty stillness like a hive after a stone had been thrown in. Ivy Cottage, so quiet the day before, was now ringed with slush marked by heavy boots. Inspector Slack had stationed a constable at the gate, which made villagers stare and whisper as they passed, pretending to admire the snow-laden hedges. The post-office bell tinkled endlessly, for everyone had errands that required them to linger long enough to overhear Miss Weatherby's tidings. The story grew with each telling, acquiring embellishments. The wine had been poisoned with cyanide, some said. Others insisted Mrs. Harrington had been strangled before collapsing, and that the poison story was a cover. Truth had not yet emerged, but gossip had already taken its form. Miss Marple, however, was not inclined to linger at the post office that morning. She had observed enough already to begin sorting patterns from conjecture. She stepped lightly across the snowy lane with her umbrella tucked neatly under her arm, and made her way toward the vicarage, where she knew Len Clement would be preparing his sermon, but where Griselda would have more urgent business, managing the influx of speculation with her usual blend of curiosity and indignation. Griselda greeted Miss Marple at the door with the exclamation, "Jane, you'll never believe what they're saying now. Slack thinks it was deliberate. Poison, yes, but he's sure it was slipped into her glass on purpose. And of course he's already decided who did it." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "That sounds like Inspector Slack," she said gently. "He likes things neat. But life, I find, rarely is." She set her umbrella by the stand and accepted a cup of tea, though her mind was not on warmth but on recollection. She had seen Mrs. Harrington shift glasses, one small act that had escaped most eyes but not hers. That detail clung like a burr. Inside the vicarage parlour, Colonel Melchett was already present, his ruddy face drawn into a scowl. He looked up when Miss Marple entered. "Glad you've come, Jane. You see, Slack has set his sights on young Lionel Pike. Says the fellow had been quarrelling with her, and that he was hovering close enough at the party to have interfered with the sherry tray. Damn nonsense, if you ask me, but once Slack's got a notion, he runs with it." Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting bag resting on her lap like a small pet. "I dare say Lionel may have quarrelled," she murmured. "Young men do when feelings are hurt or ambitions thwarted. But a quarrel is not the same thing as murder. Still, one mustn't ignore that she did call him a coward, did she not?" Griselda, perched on the sofa's edge, leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, everyone knows that by now. Tommy Legg heard it, and you know what that means. Half the village knows within an hour. But what I can't see is why Lionel would want her dead. Unless," her eyes sparkled with curiosity, "unless she knew something about him," Melchett grunted. "That's the direction Slack will take. He'll say Lionel feared exposure of some kind. But what puzzles me is what Mrs. Harrington was doing here in the first place. She wasn't exactly village stock, was she? American with a fortune, living in a little ivy-covered cottage like some genteel recluse. Doesn't ring true." Miss Marple glanced at the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle. "Money has a way of complicating even the simplest of lives. And sometimes, Colonel, people come to a place like St. Mary Mead, not for peace but for concealment. A small village, you know, offers a very convenient sort of anonymity, so long as one behaves just enough like everyone else." The Colonel looked startled. "Concealment? You think she was hiding something?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Did Inspector Slack mention anything about a letter? A registered one, perhaps?" Melchett frowned. "Not to me. Why?" "Oh, only that such things often arrive at inconvenient times," Miss Marple said mildly, as though it were no more than idle speculation. But her eyes had grown thoughtful. She remembered Miss Weatherby's remark about the letter signed for at noon. What message had it carried that might have disturbed Mrs. Harrington, so on the very day she died? Later that afternoon the inquiry deepened. Slack called Lionel Pike to the police station in Much Benham, and the sight of him trudging through the snow with his collar turned up and his lips pressed tight provided the village with enough conversation to fuel an entire evening. Mrs. Price Ridley declared him guilty before he had even stepped out of sight, while Miss Hartnell remarked loudly that he had always looked too earnest for her liking, which surely pointed to something concealed. At the Green Man, Mr. Archer offered discounted ale to anyone willing to discuss Lionel's fate, and by dusk it was accepted as fact that he was guilty. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. That evening she sat by her parlour window, her knitting untouched, and considered the crumbs of detail that lay before her. Lionel Pike might have quarrelled with Mrs. Harrington, but the act of murder, so sudden, so cleverly contrived, did not fit the clumsy anger of a youth. It smacked of calculation. And calculation, Miss Marple knew, belonged to someone with more than wounded pride. It belonged to someone with a secret to protect. The next day she paid a call at Ivy Cottage, where Clara Briggs received her with a mixture of surprise and relief. The house seemed oddly stripped of warmth, though a fire had been lit in the grate. "You must forgive the disorder, Miss Marple," Clara said, wringing her hands. "The police have been through every drawer, every cupboard. My mistress, poor lady, would have hated it." She paused, lowering her voice. She was not easy to serve, but she had her kindnesses, and she was afraid, you know. Afraid of something. "Afraid?" Miss Marple repeated gently, settling herself into a chair. "Of what sort of thing?" Clara hesitated. "I cannot say for certain, but she received letters from London often. Sometimes she tore them to pieces without reading. Other times she would sit staring at them for hours. And once I found her weeping. She said nothing, only that the past has long arms. I thought at the time it was a romantic remark. But now She broke off, pressing her handkerchief to her eyes. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The past does have long arms, Clara. Very long indeed." She asked with apparent casualness whether Mrs. Harrington had many visitors. Clara mentioned only Mr. Godfrey, who managed her lease, and occasionally Mrs. Pike, who had come selling tickets. "No one else?" Miss Marple prompted. Clara hesitated again. "There was a gentleman, just once the day before." Dark coat, soft voice. He seemed familiar to her, yet she was terribly agitated afterwards. When Miss Marple left Ivy Cottage, the snow crunched beneath her boots, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Her mind was busy. A gentleman in a dark coat, a registered letter, an argument with Lionel, and the subtle gesture of changing glasses. Each detail tugged at the web she was weaving in her mind. Yet the threads did not quite meet. Not yet. That evening she dined at the Bantrys, for Dolly would not rest until she had company. Dolly, flushed from sherry, repeated for the 100th time how ghastly it was, and how she could not possibly open her drawing-room again without thinking of that dreadful scene. Colonel Bantry muttered that murder at Christmas was indecent, and Miss Marple soothed them both with gentle murmurs. Yet even as she listened, she kept her eyes on the small details. Dolly mentioned in passing that Mrs. Harrington had insisted on sitting near the fire, despite the draught at the other end of the room. Miss Marple tucked this away with care. People did not insist without reason. By the time she returned home, her mind was settled on one point at least. Lionel Pike was not the murderer, whatever Slack believed. There was a deeper motive at work, something reaching back to Mrs. Harrington's past, and until that past was fully uncovered, the truth would remain hidden. She sat once more by her window, watching the snow fall steadily. The village would wake to another day of gossip and speculation, but beneath it all lay something darker, something that had crept quietly into St. Mary Mead and struck down a woman who had thought herself safe. Miss Marple, with her knitting folded neatly beside her, intended to discover what it was. The next day had an apologetic neatness, as if the village, ashamed of its excitement, had smoothed its hair and lowered its voice. Inspector Slack, cheerful with purpose, declared, "Promising leads," which meant several statements disagreed, but one could be made to fit. Lionel Pike, he said, had quarrelled, hovered by the tray. Zeal in Slack's arithmetic added up to guilt. Miss Marple made a quiet round. She began with Mr. Julian Godfrey, whose office above the ironmonger's was arranged as if a housemaid had squared it with a ruler. He rose anxiously. "Fair dreadful business," he said. Mrs. Harrington paid punctually and desired privacy. "I asked no questions." "People who desire privacy," Miss Marple murmured, "generally have the sort of past that does not enjoy company." "The registered letter?" He folded his hands. "Miss Weatherby gave it me to deliver at 12:15. Handwriting contrived to be ordinary. She received it calmly except for the hands. And the gentleman from town, tall, careful, pleasant, the sort who carries hush about him." Miss Marple admired his fern and left. Outside, Lydia Pike approached briskly, hat tilted like an opinion. "You may tell Slack," she said, "that he will not make a show of Lionel. My boy is rash, not wicked. Men do not kill women for a word." "You speak with maternal knowledge," Miss Marple said. "You sold bazaar tickets at Ivy Cottage." She bought 3 books, demanded proper accounts, and examined me as if I were a ledger. She also asked after Lionel's scholarship, which will now be made sinister. "Good day." She marched off, stiff with righteousness. The smell of pride pleased Miss Marple. Pride would defend Lionel from gossip and from truth alike. She set it beside other crumbs, the altered place card, the upside-down holly, the torn motto, the changed glass. In the afternoon she went to Gossington Hall. Dolly Bantry had laid the drawing-room as it had been. If crime insisted on appearing, Dolly preferred it tidy. Miss Marple stood where Mrs. Harrington had stood when the carolers sang, lifted a glass from the mantel-shelf, moved it to side table and tray. Graves, the borrowed butler, watched gravely, "Where were the crackers?" she asked. "On the low table, madam." "And Mrs. Harrington sat?" "By the fire. She stood very square with the music. And this tray—" Polly Larch set it down. "I observed no interference. There seldom is that one observes," Miss Marple said. "Was there a second tray?" "I took one to the library for gentlemen who pretended interest in the Colonel's new fly-tying vice." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "And to Dolly, you switched 2 place cards?" "I did," Dolly admitted. "It may be nothing," Miss Marple said. "Only a murderer arranges a room beforehand. A sudden change makes a ripple. One notices what struggles to stay still. Dusk was pewter when she reached Ivy Cottage. Clara Briggs let her in. The police have been through everything, miss. She would have hated it." "Some women loathe rummaging, unless it is they who rummage," Miss Marple said. "May I warm my hands?" The ash beneath the fire showed tiny black islands. "Someone burned a letter after the police left," Miss Marple observed. Clara started. "Only torn bits from the basket. There was an envelope with a sort of crest. A circle like a clock. Yes, or a cross on a watch face. I did not look. Did your mistress speak of Switzerland?" "No, miss. New York once." She hesitated. "Yesterday I thought I saw a man at the back gate watching the kitchen window. Collar up. When I went out, only tracks. Long strides. Toes turned out?" "Yes." She did not follow the tracks, but asked to see the drawer where trifles lived. Clara produced elastics, stamps, a twist of thread, and at the back the other half of a cracker motto, still with its tiny tack. Miss Marple joined it to the torn piece in her bag. Mended, it read, "Best intentions lead the blind down familiar lanes." Outside she met Inspector Slack, boots squeaking. "Collecting scraps, are you?" he asked. "I have more solid stuff. Chemist found bitter almond on the glass. Cyanide. Our young Pike had opportunity. His alibi is missed. Cyanide is quick," Miss Marple said, "and unreliable unless one controls the glass. Mrs. Harrington changed hers." "Dose could be on 2 glasses," Slack said, "or the decanter." "Then we should have a procession," Miss Marple said mildly, "and we have only a solitary lady." He announced he would arrest Lionel at breakfast and strode on. Miss Marple continued slowly, thinking of crests and clocks, of cash for everything, of a tall, careful man and a letter that tried to be ordinary. She thought of the upside-down holly, a childish signal for distress or a habit from elsewhere. By starlight she reached the vicarage. Griselda opened the door. "Slack will arrest Lionel in the morning. Len is noble and furious. What can we do?" "We shall have tea," Miss Marple said, "and invite Mr. Archer. He knows margins. Perhaps he also knows which firms insist on cash and keep discreet time." Mr. Archer, flattered, arrived. He ate scones like fees and listened, while Miss Marple's questions unspooled. Had he known Mrs. Harrington before she took Ivy Cottage? Not to his recollection. Had she asked about remitting funds abroad? Briefly. "Cautious creature," he said. "Wanted diversions. Swiss houses?" Miss Marple asked. "Naturally. Stability, privacy, clocks," he said. "One discreet concern marks envelopes with a tiny circle. And credit, quite the reverse. Cash for everything." When he had gone, Len looked rueful. "Are we financiers now, Jane?" "We are anatomists," Miss Marple said. "Money is only the body on which motives grow." That night, while Frost made the lanes ring like china, she set her crumbs in order. A woman insists on privacy, pays in cash, receives a letter that pretends ordinariness, meets a tall, careful man, quarrels with an ardent youth, changes her glass at the last second, and dies of a poison that demands accuracy. Add the stitched motto and the ripple from Dolly's switch. Add a man at a gate with turned-out toes, and Lydia's readiness to fight the village. Near midnight, Miss Marple reached a decision. Lionel Pike must not be arrested at breakfast. Such things fix themselves here like marks in butter. If the right person were made a little uneasy, he or she might show the neatness that betrays. She put on her shawl and wrote 2 notes. One invited Mr. Archer to drop casually the name of the Swiss concern with the handless clock, should Slack be within earshot. The other asked Dolly to host a small, early tea next day to restore Christmas spirit, with the original seating restored. She sat by the window watching the hard stars and thinking of Christmas crackers, bright paper, tiny bang foolish motto, and sometimes, if one were careless, a pin left sticking where a hand would surely go. A murderer of tidy habits, she reflected, often leaves a pin. One only has to put on one's glove at the right moment to feel it. Morning came. Inspector Slack, punctual as a gong, reached Lionel Pike's cottage intending to arrest him, and met Lydia in the hall, gloved and resolute. She told him her son had gone to Gossington Hall for tea by invitation. "At this hour?" he demanded. "Christmas waits for no policeman," she said, and closed the door with chilly civility. At the Bantries the fire burned briskly, and the drawing-room stood as it had on Christmas Eve. Tree glimmering, greenery crisp, the sherry tray and the same glasses in their places. Dolly, brave and tremulous, had agreed to every detail. "If we must remember," she had said, "we'll remember tidily." Miss Marple arrived early and took a chair near the hearth, looking small and soft, like a patient snowflake. She smiled at Graves and asked for nothing. They came quietly. Julian Godfrey was precise. Mr. Archer wore his most respectable waistcoat. Lionel, pale but upright, stood beside his mother. And last of all, Slack. "Purely social," he said, removing his hat. "But one shouldn't miss tea because life is inconvenient." "Quite," Miss Marple murmured. "It is easier to be truthful with a plate in one's hand," Dolly proposed that everyone take the places they had occupied on Christmas Eve. She produced the little cards she had used and slid them into position with apologetic care. When she nudged Julian Godfrey's card an inch to the left to match the night, her earlier caprice had moved it there. Miss Marple saw the faintest recoil tighten his shoulder and vanish. Graves brought the sherry. Dolly's hand hovered. Then she smiled and drew the stopper. "You will forgive me if we omit the crackers," she said. "They seem unlucky." Glasses went round. Miss Marple watched eyes rather than fingers. Lionel accepted his with the gratitude of the reprieved. Lydia refused, claiming sherry before noon made her sneeze. Griselda took hers and forgot it to rescue a sliding cushion. Godfrey coughed. Slack wet his lips and set the glass down with a deliberate click. "It is curious," Miss Marple observed vaguely, "how people have habits with glasses. I knew a lady who always chose the second from the left. She thought the first had dust. Another exchanged hers if the foot did not ring true on the table." She tapped lightly. The nearest glass chimed and was answered faintly by its neighbour. "Superstition," Slack said. "I prefer facts." "Facts are only habits grown respectable," Miss Marple murmured, and looked at Dolly. "Another for Mr. Godfrey, perhaps?" "No, thank you," Godfrey said quickly. "One is poor at sherry before luncheon." "Ah," Miss Marple replied. "Yet you delivered a registered letter at noon the day she died. How punctual appetite can be." She let the thought drift. Slack's nostrils twitched at the word registered. He changed his stance, attentive. Dolly rang for sandwiches to drown earnestness in comfort. As Graves set the plate down, his sleeve brushed a cracker and the paper tore. A narrow strip fluttered to the carpet near Lydia's foot. She stooped, brisk and practical, and passed it to Graves. "Allow me," Miss Marple said, and took it. "Best intentions lead the blind down familiar lanes," when she read. "How melancholy for a cracker." "Not from mine," Dolly said. "Bellamy's mottos say Happy Christmas and very little else." Miss Marple turned the slip. A rusty bruise showed near the edge. "Pinned," she murmured. "Tidy people dislike loose ends. Pins and paper," Slack grunted. "I have cyanide, and I have arrangements," Miss Marple replied. "Someone rehearsed this room, disliked a small change, and corrected it during the carols. Someone who marks things lightly, trusts a signal to restore order if a flurry disturbs it." She glanced toward the window. "One holly sprig was upside down that night. Not a mistake. A reminder, this is first, as it were. Once you know first, you can find second and third." Then a marked glass returns to the intended hand without effort, even if the tray is moved. Godfrey set down his own with a clink. Mrs. Harrington was no child, he said. She knew her mind. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. She had a quick eye for dust, if not for malice. She changed her glass when she thought it safer. But the hand that dislikes variation will steady a tray and place a thing without seeming to. Solicitors and those connected with them do it unconsciously. They direct by touching as lightly as breath. Slack looked at Godfrey's immaculate sleeve and then at the tray, his expression closed, which in him meant opening his mind. Mr. Archer cleared his throat. You spoke of the post. Only that Mrs. Harrington believed money bought quiet, Miss Marple said. She had arrangements elsewhere that followed her here. A letter contrived to look ordinary arrived at noon. A careful gentleman from town called. She was reminded to sit where she was meant. Dolly's little change made a ripple. Someone could not bear the ripple. Blackmail? Slack demanded. Not the vulgar sort, Miss Marple said. Trustees of a different kind, administering silence and expecting obedience. When obedience faltered, precision stepped in. Cyanide is a precise person's weapon, and safest when the glass can be identified by touch. Lydia's eyes widened a fraction. Archer swallowed. Godfrey's gaze did not flicker, which was almost as good as panic. Dolly, eager to be useful, said, "We can try a game, Jane." "Yes," Miss Marple smiled. "Graves, be so kind as to fetch a spoon." She dipped it in water and touched it to 3 glass feet. 2 rang bright. 1 sounded slightly dead. "A smear on the foot makes a different little song," she said. "If you lay the glasses in a certain order and then, should the room be rearranged, correct the order by touch, you need not look at all." Slack stared. "You say the marked one went to Mrs. Harrington." "It did," Miss Marple answered mild. "Only she moved it away, as I saw. Later, when the carols made bustle, another hand restored it to her. That is why a single person died where a dozen could have." "And who restored it?" Slack asked. "The person most offended by Dolly's change of place," Miss Marple said, and her eyes rested just for a friendly heartbeat on Godfrey. "But this is only tea, Inspector. The bank in Much Benham can tell you whose cash paid Ivy Cottage and whence remittances came. Quiet often leaves arithmetic." Lydia glanced at Lionel and lifted her chin. Griselda, who hated silences, said brightly, "Do have a sandwich, Inspector. It will prevent something rash." Slack did not move. Miss Marple folded the mottled strip and slipped it beside its twin in her reticule. "Thank you, dear Dolly," she said, rising. "Repetition is such a help. It is what gives patterns away." The fire crackled. Outside, the snow brightened the hedges. Inside, no one touched the sherry again. Miss Marple, who had never needed anything so crude as an arrest to know she was right, asked for her coat and, with a contented nod to the room, went out into the clean, cold day, thinking about ordinary envelopes that arrive on extraordinary days. Inspector Slack left the Bantry's drawing-room in a state of gruff indecision, muttering something about bank records and London letters. The guests dispersed soon after, each retreating to their own firesides. But the air in St. Mary Mead remained restless. A tea that had begun as a polite exercise in reconstruction had ended with an unmistakable ripple of unease. There had been no direct accusation, of course. Miss Marple's manner never allowed for such bluntness, but everyone had seen where her quiet gaze had lingered. For those who were paying attention, the room had grown charged, as though the faintest crack had been struck in the neat surface of Julian Godfrey's composure. Miss Marple walked home beneath the brittle starlight, her pace steady, though her thoughts moved quickly. She was not satisfied, not yet. Pieces were falling into place. The registered letter, the careful rearrangements, the obsession with order that belonged to a particular kind of man, but motive was still a blur. People did not poison elegant widows simply to tidy place cards. There had to be something deeper, older, the sort of entanglement that money and reputation always seemed to breed. She reminded herself as she tightened her shawl against the frost that patience was the best ally of truth. Human nature, if observed long enough, would always betray itself. The following morning the village hummed anew. At the post office, Miss Weatherby was brisk with parcels, but less brisk with her tongue. She leaned forward confidentially when Miss Marple collected a letter from her nephew. It said the late Mrs. Harrington was mixed up with foreign banking, Miss Marple. Swiss, no less. They say a gentleman from London came to see her about it, though what a lady needs with foreign accounts I can't imagine. Unless, of course, there were difficulties. She glanced meaningfully at the queue behind. Miss Marple smiled benignly and tucked the letter into her bag, though her mind quickened. A foreign bank with the symbol of a clock face, payments in cash, and now a London gentleman. She recalled Clara Briggs's description of the soft-voiced visitor. A woman afraid of her past, trying to keep it at arm's length with money, would eventually discover that money was not quite enough. Silence had its own greedy accountants. Later that day she paid another visit to Ivy Cottage. Clara opened the door at once, her eyes red from weeping but her manner eager, as if she hoped Miss Marple might provide some comfort or clarity. The rooms felt bare without their mistress, though the faintest trace of her perfume lingered in the hall. Clara poured tea and spoke with a nervous rush. "Inspector Slack asked about the letters again, miss. He says if there was blackmail, there must be drafts, demands, receipts. But she destroyed everything always. Burned them in the hearth as soon as she read them. I begged her not to. Said it would only look worse if anyone pried. She told me, Clara, paper is dangerous. What matters is what one remembers." And then she laughed, as if it weren't quite funny. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Did she ever speak of her life before St. Mary Mead?" "Not much," Clara admitted. "Only that her first husband was English. She met him in New York. He died long ago, and she kept his name. But once, when she thought I wasn't listening, she said she was tired of being punished for something she had done when she was young. I don't know what she meant. She never explained. The words stayed with Miss Marple long after she left Ivy Cottage. Punished for something done long ago. That, she reflected, was the essence of so many tragedies. Past mistakes dragged forward like a heavy trunk, each mile heavier than the last. She could think of several respectable gentlemen in St. Mary Mead who would have understood the art of concealment, but Julian Godfrey in particular had the temperament. Solicitors lived by discretion, by knowing precisely what must not be spoken of, and sometimes by ensuring that it never was. That evening, at the vicarage, Colonel Melchett joined the Clements for supper, and Miss Marple was invited as well. Over shepherd's pie and claret, Melchett relayed his frustrations. Slack is still thundering about Lionel Pike. He claims the boy had no alibi strong enough to stand, and that a quarrel is the best motive we've got. But I don't like it. There's something too obvious about the whole thing. Quite, Miss Marple agreed softly. Lionel is too hot-headed, too impulsive. Cyanide requires precision, Colonel. It is the work of someone who measures, not someone who flares. One cannot trust chance with such a weapon. Griselda leaned forward eagerly. Then who, Jane? You saw how Godfrey looked today. All stiff and careful, as if he were balancing a dozen ledgers in his head. You must think it's him. Miss Marple smiled at her knitting, letting the needles click softly. I think, my dear, that neatness and secrecy often walk together, and when one finds them side by side, it is best to look very closely indeed. But proof is another matter. We must be patient. It was late when she returned home. Snow had begun to fall again, muffling the world in silence. She sat by her lamp, her knitting set aside, and reviewed the facts in her orderly fashion. A woman, newly arrived in the village, clearly wealthy, paying everything in cash. A registered letter, an unknown gentleman's Swiss accounts, a solicitor delivering letters with too much precision, a glass marked, restored to its place, and a motto pinned, as though even chance amusements required control. Piece by piece the pattern strengthened. The next day brought a development. Mr. Archer, the innkeeper, called at Miss Marple's cottage, visibly uncomfortable. I thought you ought to know, ma'am. "There's been a fellow asking about Mrs. Harrington. Said he was a friend from London. Tall chap, dark overcoat, careful way of speaking. Asked me if she'd left anything behind here. I didn't tell him much, of course, but he seemed to know more than he let on." Miss Marple thanked him kindly. When he had gone, she sat very still. The careful gentleman again. If he lingered in the village, it meant unfinished business. And unfinished business often meant danger. That evening she attended choir practice at the church, where Lionel Pike sang with distracted fervour. His eyes followed Clara Briggs when she slipped in at the back, as if he hoped for absolution in her gaze. Miss Marple noted the detail, filed it away. Griselda whispered afterwards that Lionel had declared his innocence to anyone who would listen, but the village was divided. Half believed him guilty, half believed him persecuted. Only Miss Marple seemed to think the true answer lay elsewhere. Later, as she walked home beneath the church bells, she paused by the lich gate. The snow lay untouched except for one set of footprints, long and deliberate, leading away toward Ivy Cottage. She bent and studied them in the moonlight. Toes turned outward, stride measured. She had seen such tracks before, described by Clara. A man who walked with order even when alone. She straightened, the cold air biting her cheeks, and her mind clicked once more into alignment. The next stage of her plan would require subtlety. People revealed themselves most clearly not when accused, but when given the chance to act freely, under the impression that no one was watching. She thought of a phrase her nephew had once written in a letter. "Set the stage, Aunt Jane, and let the players show their parts." That, she resolved, was precisely what must be done. At home, she wrote 2 short notes before bed. One was to Colonel Melchett, suggesting that certain financial records might be discreetly examined at the bank in Much Benham. The other was to Dolly Bantry, proposing a small gathering at Gossington Hall in 2 days' time. Nothing formal, nothing to alarm, just an afternoon of tea and carols to restore cheer. But Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that if the gathering took place under the right conditions, the careful gentleman, or the one who shared his habits, would not be able to resist putting everything back in its proper order. And then, she thought, the truth would reveal itself as naturally as footprints in fresh snow. Snow still lay thick upon the lanes when Dolly Bantry received Miss Marple's note, and though her first instinct was to protest, after all, another gathering so soon after the dreadful business seemed almost indecent, she soon yielded. Jane had a way of persuading without insisting, and Dolly's innate sense of curiosity, combined with her loyalty, made refusal impossible. Thus it was agreed, a modest affair, no more than a handful of neighbours, an afternoon of tea and carols to restore the village's cheer. Yet beneath the outward innocence of the plan lay a quiet calculation, one that Miss Marple carried with her like an unseen script. The day arrived clear and sharp, the kind of winter light that turned icicles into daggers of glass. Within Gossington Hall, Dolly had arranged the drawing-room just as before, fire blazing, holly on the mantel, the tree adorned, and the same table where the sherry tray had rested on Christmas Eve. It was not ostentatious but exact. That exactness mattered. Miss Marple, arriving early, congratulated Dolly on her faithfulness of detail, and suggested in her gentle way that the sherry be set out once again, even if most would decline it. Dolly complied, her lips pressed in both discomfort and anticipation. One by one the guests appeared. Griselda Clement swept in first, bright and talkative, determined to make things lively. Lionel Pike followed, subdued but grateful for the inclusion, his mother Lydia close behind, her posture stiff with vigilance. Mr. Archer arrived, apologetic but curious. Julian Godfrey entered last, perfectly composed, his overcoat brushed free of snow, his manner correct. Inspector Slack had not been invited, but Colonel Melchett had. He came with his habitual bluntness, muttering that he hoped it wasn't another of Jane's staging experiments, though the sparkle in his eye betrayed his respect. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her knitting on her lap the very image of comfort. She made no speech, asked no leading question, but her eyes wandered from face to face, watching the small gestures, the ways hands rested, how eyes strayed to the tray or the place cards Dolly had once more positioned. Conversation began stiffly. Mrs. Bantry on the difficulty of obtaining decent holly berries this season, Griselda on the choir's carol program, Lionel mumbling his agreement. Slowly, though, the undercurrent emerged, as Miss Marple knew it would. Archer remarked, in what seemed idle chatter, that the post office had been busier than ever with foreign letters this season. Dolly seized on the subject, exclaiming at the expense of sending anything abroad. Lydia Pike sniffed and declared she had no patience for foreign banks or their secrecy, her words sharper than she intended. Lionel flushed at her tone, as though he feared her vehemence drew suspicion. Godfrey alone kept his silence, sipping tea with measured calm, his eyes lowered. It was then that Miss Marple lifted her head and spoke with deliberate mildness. "It is curious, is it not," she said, "how letters arrive at the most inconvenient times. A registered one, for example, delivered at noon on Christmas Eve. Such a small thing, yet how it alters the course of an afternoon. I have always thought that registered letters are more burden than blessing. Too much formality, too much certainty. A little untidiness in the post, after all, often spares people a good deal of trouble." Her words, though gently spoken, fell like a stone in water. Lionel looked puzzled, Griselda intrigued, Lydia impatient. But Julian Godfrey's teacup hesitated, just before it touched the saucer. Only a fraction, only for an instant, but enough for Miss Marple's sharp eyes. He recovered at once, setting it down neatly and remarking, with a smile too precise, "I have always preferred certainty myself." The silence that followed was broken by Dolly, who suggested a round of carols to lighten the atmosphere. Griselda went to the piano and struck the first notes, her voice bright and eager. The others joined hesitantly at first, then with more confidence. While the voices filled the room, Miss Marple's eyes returned to the tray. One glass, ever so slightly apart from the rest, caught the firelight differently. She remembered the faint sound it had made when struck before, the dull note betraying its mark. Quietly, while all attention was on the carol, she shifted her knitting bag and brushed her hand against the glass. It rang low and muted. The same mark remained. When the carol ended, she spoke again, so softly that only those nearest could hear. "It is a comfort, I think, that habits betray us. One cannot live a life of neatness without leaving traces. The glass that does not ring true, the motto with a pin still in it, the holly sprig turned upside down, each one no more than a crumb, yet together they form a trail. And trails, you know, always lead somewhere." Colonel Melchett stirred uneasily, sensing the gathering storm. Lionel glanced from one face to another, his youth unable to mask his confusion. Lydia stiffened, as though preparing to shield her son from accusation. But it was Julian Godfrey who shifted most imperceptibly, the corners of his mouth tightening. He made no protest, no defense, only the silence of a man who knows that denial would betray him more than acceptance. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. "I dare say we have all wondered what brought Mrs. Harrington to St. Mary Mead. She was not one of us, after all. She came here with money, but money does not arrive by itself. It is carried, transferred, administered. It requires arrangements. And arrangements, when they sour, can become dangerous." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. Mrs. Harrington thought to purchase silence. But silence is costly, and those who manage it do not easily forgive hesitation. Griselda's eyes widened. Dolly clasped her hands together. Colonel Melchett muttered a curse under his breath. Lionel, pale, whispered, "Then it wasn't me." "It wasn't." His mother hushed him sharply. Julian Godfrey rose then, slowly, with all the dignity of his profession. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice even, "you make delicate suggestions that could ruin reputations. Without evidence, they are dangerous." Miss Marple smiled, calm as the snow outside. Oh, but evidence lies in behavior, Mr. Godfrey, in the order one restores after a ripple, in the way you touched the tray on Christmas Eve, when Mrs. Harrington, with her quick suspicion, tried to change her glass, in the letter you delivered so promptly, though you must have known its sender by more than handwriting, in the habit of pinning a motto rather than leaving it loose. You see, I do not accuse. I only notice. And I noticed that Mrs. Harrington looked not at Lionel Pike when she died, but at you. It was recognition, not surprise. The silence that followed was heavy as snow upon branches. Godfrey's face did not alter, but his hands, clasped tightly before him, betrayed the faintest tremor. It was Dolly who broke the stillness, whispering, "Oh, Jane, you've done it again." Miss Marple only shook her head gently. "Not done, Dolly, not yet. The past will finish the work. It always does." She looked again at Godfrey, whose composure had grown almost too perfect, the mask of a man holding back the collapse of order. She knew it would not hold for long. The right nudge, the right revelation, and the truth would emerge fully. But for now she let the silence linger, letting each person in the room feel the weight of it, until the fire popped and the carols began again, more subdued than before. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks, smoothing edges, making everything seem pure again. But within the warm drawing-room, beneath the surface of politeness, something dark stirred, waiting for the moment it would no longer be denied. Miss Marple, with her needles clicking softly once more, knew the moment was close at hand. Very close indeed. The guests drifted away after the second carol, and the room settled as a pond settles when the last pebble has sunk. Colonel Melchett lingered, hopeful for a cue. Miss Marple gave him none. Julian Godfrey bowed with correctness and stepped out into the white afternoon, his hat set with a mathematician's care. She went home by the long way, letting the crisp air rinse her thoughts. Method was clear, hand almost certain. Motive still wore a veil. A woman does not buy silence for years, unless memory is a creditor. The registered letter had not created a debt. It had called one in. By evening the village had retreated to its hearths. At the Green Man, a careful gentleman in a dark coat, seen before, sat alone, nursing the rim of an empty glass. Mr. Archer judged him of the tribe who tidied other men's muddles for a fee, and resolved, if asked, to remember little. The shout came near midnight. Clara Briggs cried from Ivy Cottage. The sound ran along the snow like a struck wire. Miss Marple's lamp flared at once. She was a small figure in a large night, but the wind let her pass as if it knew she would only be a moment. The kitchen door had been forced with thin iron. The hall smelt of draught and singed paper. Clara held out a biscuit tin that scorched the fingers. "I heard someone," she gasped. "When I came down, the fire was stirred, and this lay on the rug." "It isn't ours." Miss Marple glanced at the hearth. Ash lay in two colours, one old, one new. The older sifted into neatness, the newer clotted and grey. In the parlour, the cushions sat too squarely after being moved. Drawer knobs were a hair askew. At the writing desk, the pigeonhole for penny stamps gaped empty. She pressed the carpet near a front leg. The pile showed a bruise. She lifted the leg and found beneath it a thin metal disc, impressed with a circle like a clock face without hands. She slid it into her "Keys to the back gate?" she asked, returning to the kitchen. "Only me, Miss, and Mr. Godfrey. He said it was necessary for the lease." "Necessary things are often the convenient ones," said Miss Marple. "Boil the kettle, dear. Hot water steadies memory." By morning the story had sprouted twigs. Burglary, mysterious fires, a stranger in a dark coat. Inspector Slack arrived damp with importance and tried to stamp all three flat. He poked the hearth and dismissed the tin, until Clara, steadier now, described the forced door and missing stamps. "Stamps?" he objected. "What use—" "Receipt stamps," Miss Marple said mildly. "For money orders. Some people pay only in cash and yet like proofs. Figures written on the gummed side can look awkward afterwards. One might burn them, if one had tidied rather too far." Slack's expression began to listen. Colonel Melchett, who had waited for permission to be official, produced a telegram. From Zurich via the Yard, he said, "That emblem you sent, Jane. Private Trust Company. 2 accounts, same introducer. 1 Harrington. 1 Godfrey." Slack's grunt was almost reverent. "Well, walk softly," Miss Marple advised. "Men who live by paper build fall traps with it." Elsewhere, another sort of paper moved. The careful gentleman at the Green Man asked Mr. Archer for his discretion and a coffee. He introduced himself as Mr. Nash, and hoped never to be introduced again. "I represent interests," he said, "that are best left as grammar." He inquired whether the late Mrs. Harrington had left a parcel with the inn. She had not. "Then memory must serve," he concluded. Feared phrase, but it can still hold. News of Mr. Nash reached the vicarage by luncheon. Griselda enjoyed the romance. Len bristled. Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. "He is no policeman," she said, "and not a villain. He closes accounts in the moral sense. He will value pattern over pity." "What pattern?" asked Len. "The one Mrs. Harrington attempted to alter," Miss Marple replied. "A woman who was once convenient became inconvenient. She wished to speak in tune. She had been hired to hum. That afternoon the bank manager sent over cancelled drafts and a note, anxious and perspiring. Among them, Melchett found an enclosure in Mrs. Harrington's hand, clipped to an unlicked receipt stamp. "No more. Send the account to me directly, or I speak. L.H. The initials were plain, the sentiment plainer." Melchett set his jaw and went at once to Julian Godfrey's office. He found it empty and exemplary, fern-watered, blotter blameless, drawer clean as a moral pamphlet. On the stairs, Mr. Nash regarded the ironmongery in the window with professional melancholy. "He has gone to repair or to ruin," he said. "It is often the same errand." Snow came on again toward dusk, a set of curtains being drawn. Dolly Bantry paced. Lydia Pike set a chain on her door. Clara dozed upright with a cup cooling at her elbow. Miss Marple laid 2 objects on her table, the mended cracker motto and the metal disc with the handless clock. They made a peculiar pair, intention and instrument, conscience fastened by mechanism. She thought that wickedness is merely order turned inside out. The knock, when it came, was soft and punctual. Julian Godfrey stood on her threshold, with a face no longer fitting. He removed his hat, positioned it on the table's edge, and said in a tone chosen for registers rather than rooms, "I have come to ask you not to speak, Miss Marple." "About what, Mr. Godfrey?" "About the glass. About the letter. About ordinary arrangements that never benefit from publicity. They concern a dead woman," Miss Marple said. "And living ones, too." He stared at the mended motto without seeing it. "She had signed," he said at last. "Years ago. She accepted the income. She rebelled at the discipline. When she threatened to reveal me as trustee, everything I have is forfeit. A man who loses reputation loses the right to make order. The world becomes insufferably untidy. And someone's breath becomes very tidy indeed," Miss Marple answered. "You arranged the tray and the room. When Mrs. Bantry moved a place card, you were offended by the ripple. You marked a glass and later, when the Carrolls gave you cover, restored it to the intended hand." His eyelids fell and rose. "If she had kept her place," he said, "there would have been no scene. A swift, mistaken catastrophe. The doctor would have called it heart." He drew a breath that rattled. "I did not consider myself cruel. I considered myself neat." "Neatness is such a tempting word," Miss Marple said. "It excuses everything except grief." He looked at her, and for an instant there was a man under the profession. "Will you call the police?" "I shall speak first to the person in greatest danger if I do not," she said. "That is to say, you. Sit down, Mr. Godfrey. We must see exactly how much ruin can be saved from being total." He hesitated, then sat. Outside, snow softened the village edges. Inside, habit finally loosened its hold. Julian Godfrey sat very straight in Miss Marple's small parlour, as if posture could still enforce a line of order through the middle of a ruin. The lamplight showed the dryness of his hands and the faint polish where habit had smoothed his pen fingers. He looked not so much frightened as affronted by circumstance, like a man whose careful shelves had been kicked awry. Miss Marple, who had known boys that broke their toys to be spared the sight of others breaking them, waited without impatience. "You think me a monster," he said at last, voice level. "I am a clerk who made himself indispensable. That is the worst sort. We tidy life until it owes us interest." "I think," said Miss Marple, "that you did a wicked thing in the manner neat men prefer. You have not quite decided whether to call it wickedness or repair." He considered, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Repair," he said, with the candor of a man who despises euphemism. "Years ago Mrs. Harrington entered an arrangement. More accurately, her maiden self did. She was then Louise Potter. She kept accounts for a theatrical syndicate that required a trustee to translate cash into quietness. I was junior, diligent, chosen to witness signatures. Later, when an English marriage gave her a new name and a new life, the income continued. No one minded so long as she wrote checks, smiled and kept her old arithmetic locked. Then she became pious about the past. Not pious, Miss Marple corrected gently. Tired, he conceded, and indiscreet. She threatened to name names if the trust would not come to her directly. That registered letter repeated the threat in writing. "I delivered it," I advised caution. She laughed. She had begun to find moral value in chaos. He removed his spectacles, polished them with a pocket square that made a small, dry sound. "I will not cheapen myself with melodrama. I obtained prussic acid lawfully. Our office keeps a bottle for stamp lifting and plate cleaning, locked, signed out. The dose is a pinprick. The method requires discipline. I prepared a glass, marked it for recognition, and intended a misadventure in a crowd. When Mrs. Bantry moved a card, I felt immoderately defied. I corrected. That is the accurate word. I corrected. Miss Marple's needles lay idle in her lap. "You were not alone in correcting," she said. "Someone came to Ivy Cottage in the night and burned things that did not belong to him." His eyes sharpened. "No, I do not burglary. Too much dust. That will be Mr. Nash. He has been sent by men who prefer decimals to consciences. He frightens me in the way accountants frighten, by balancing to zero." "You expect him to balance you," Miss Marple said. He was silent. The faintest noise from the lane, a wheelbarrow perhaps, passed like a thought. He asked me, delicately, to make the police prefer a village boy. I said I dealt in documents, not destinies. He said destinies are documents other people file. After your tea today, he will revise his strategy. Then you came to me to be filed differently, Miss Marple said. What would you have me do? He looked for the first time simply tired. Tell Melchett first. He is a blunt instrument and will not bargain. If I go to Slack, Nash will anticipate me. If I go to Nash, I am already filed. He paused. You do not tidy. You put things where they always were and make people see it. Not quite always where they were, Miss Marple said and rose. Where they belong, he stood too. There is one more thing. Louise, Mrs. Harrington, kept a single document. She told me in her kitchen that if I forced her hand she would show it to the man from London and then to the newspapers. It proved, she said so with relish, that a marriage on which much respectability here depends was never valid. I supposed she meant a person in the village, which seemed melodramatic. Now I am not so sure. Which marriage? Miss Marple asked almost kindly. I do not know. She teased me with half-truths. She liked to see me disarranged. Miss Marple folded her scarf with small final strokes. Very well, she said. You will remain here until Colonel Melchett arrives. You will not attempt to correct anything else. He gave a dry, almost grateful nod, and sat again with his hat precisely on his knee. Miss Marple sent Mary with a note. Within 20 minutes, Melchett filled the doorway, snow on his shoulders, moral indignation in his breath. Slack followed, red and important. Behind them, To Miss Marple's slight surprise and no astonishment at all came Mr. Nash, courteous as a receipt. Godfrey rose and did not fuss. He spoke plainly. Slack grew pale under his ruddy skin. Melchett's jaw squared. Mr. Nash's eyelids made the smallest economy of movement. When Godfrey had finished, Nash inclined his head. "Thank you," he said, as if a statement had been delivered in duplicate. "It will spare time." "It will not spare the gallows," Melchett said roughly. "The gallows," Nash replied with gentle accuracy, "has ceased to be fashionable. But ruin is both durable and correct." "You broke into Ivy Cottage," Slack said. "On the contrary," Nash said, "I do not break. I am invited by necessity. Someone else, perhaps your conscientious trustee, was clumsy. I am careful. Ask Miss Briggs about footprints. Mine are always parallel, and permission will be found afterwards." "It is beside the point," Miss Marple interposed with the mildness that meant warning. "There is a paper missing. Without it, a corner of our little world remains willfully skewed. Mr. Godfrey believes that paper concerns a marriage that ought to flutter the village when it is put straight. I am not so fond of agitation, but I am fonder of truth." "What paper?" Slack demanded. "A certificate, I suspect," Miss Marple said. "Baptism or marriage or decree absolute. Something that makes a respectable tale untidy." Mrs. Harrington did not keep trinkets. She kept proofs. She was vain when she was young and practical when she grew afraid. "Where," Nash asked with amiable interest, "would a practical woman keep a single proof?" "In a place that is always dusted and never examined," Miss Marple replied. "The obvious shelf is the safest drawer, Mr. Nash, provided it is not one's own." Clara Briggs, sent for, arrived at speed, her breath clouding. She twisted her handkerchief, then saw Godfrey and shrank. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I truly didn't. When the gentleman came last night, I hid in the scullery. I thought if there were letters left, he'd take them and go." "Did Mrs. Harrington ever ask you to fetch a book from the Bantry's library?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, miss. A red prayer book. She said the Bantry's was larger print. Mrs. Bantry lent it willingly." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Dolly keeps her prayer books in the cabinet with the lace cloth. She dusts the top every Thursday, but she never looks under the cloth." She turned to Melchett. "Colonel, would you be so good?" They went in a small, determined convoy to Gossington Hall. Dolly, fluttered and heroic, admitted them with the air of a lady prepared to discover anything except scandal among her linens. In the drawing-room the great cabinet stood, lace-cloth immaculate. Miss Marple lifted a corner with 2 fingers. Beneath, tucked flat against the polished wood, lay a folded paper sealed with old red wax and tied with a housemaid's prudence by cotton. Dolly gasped. Melchett grunted. Slack reached and was forestalled by Mr. Nash, who merely adjusted the cloth back into exact alignment and waited. Miss Marple took up the paper herself. It was a certified copy of a marriage celebrated in New York 28 years earlier, between Louise Potter and one Edmund Pike musician, with a penciled note in a small resolute hand, "No dissolution recorded." Miss Marple looked at the handwriting and the habit of the capital letters, and knew whose pride had written the annotation. The pity that moved in her was not for Godfrey. "Lydia," she said softly, more to herself than to the room. "Oh, my dear." Melchett read, whistled under his breath, and looked at Slack. "Our village is about to be improved by truth," he said grimly, "and I cannot think of anyone who will thank us for the improvement." Nash received the paper and weighed it between finger and thumb. "Tidiness," he observed, with a courteous glance at Godfrey, "has failed to be kind." He turned to Miss Marple. "What would you have done with this?" "Put it in the light and shut the window against draughts," she said. "If a thing must be known, better it be known plainly." They left Dolly sitting down very suddenly and went into the white air again. The village had the clean look of a cold conscience. At the vicarage gate Lionel Pike came hurrying with hope in his eyes and dread behind it. He stopped dead when he saw the faces and the folded paper. Lydia, 2 steps behind him, read everything and nothing in a single glance and stood, queenly as habit and rigid as glass. Miss Marple, whose pity was practical, spoke first. "Come into the vicarage," she said. "There is room there for truth to sit in a chair." No one argued. The bells were not ringing, but it felt like the pause before notes. The vicarage parlour took them in as if it had been waiting, its fire newly coaxed and chairs positioned by a hand that believed in conversation as a moral duty. Griselda, alarmed by faces and paper, gathered cups that no one wanted. Len Clement, grave and kind, set the largest chair for Lydia, and stood by the mantel like a witness to sacrament. Miss Marple sat near the lamplight with the folded certificate resting on her lap, her fingers lightly on the cotton tie, as if it were a living thing that must not be startled. Lionel hovered in the doorway until his mother's hand, without looking, found his sleeve and drew him 2 steps nearer. Colonel Melchett did not bluster. He understood the difference between exposure and cruelty. "Mrs. Pike," he said, not without gentleness, "we have come by a document that complicates what has been dear to you. It should be explained before it is acted upon." Lydia's face had the stillness of frost. "Explain, then," she said. Her voice was controlled, but her breathing was the kind that breaks porcelain. Miss Marple unfolded the paper and read the essentials in an even tone, adding nothing and taking nothing away. When she finished, she lifted her eyes, which were very kind and very practical. "There is no dissolution recorded," she said. "If this is accurate, Edmund Pike's later vows were not vows in law. That has a way of making mischief out of nothing." Lydia looked not at the paper, but at Lionel. "You are my son," she said. "No ink can tell me else." She rose as if to put herself between him and the written world, then sat back with care because the room had moved. "Edmund told me he had no entanglements. He also told me music paid. I discovered both statements to be aspirational." Mr. Nash inclined his head with professional sorrow. "Facts are often ungenerous to aspiration, madam." Lionel spoke at last, hoarse. "So I am, what everyone will say." "Everyone," Miss Marple said, "will say what Lydia allows them to say by how she stands. Legality is one shape. Love is another. The village likes both, but knows which keeps a house warm." Lydia's mouth twitched. Half anger, half a humour so hard it shone. "I have outstared parish committees and grocery lines," she said. "I shall outstare this." She looked at the certificate, then at Miss Marple. "Louise Harrington kept it. Why?" "Because she grew tired," Miss Marple replied. "Tired of paying men who stored her past for a fee." She meant to speak, first to the London gentleman and then to any who would listen. That would have bruised certain reputations. Mr. Godfrey preferred order, and order in his mind required her. She glanced toward the hall where Slack and Melchett waited. Silenced. Julian Godfrey stood straight, the precision gone out of him like starch out of linen. "I did what I believed maintained the dignity of arrangements," he said. It is an indecent sentence now that it is spoken aloud. He looked at Lionel, not with contempt but with a weary envy, as if youth with one clear grief were preferable to middle age with a ledger of them. "I will make my statement at once." "You will sit until Colonel Melchett is ready," Miss Marple said, almost motherly. "And you will not be clever. Cleverness is what brought you here." Slack cleared his throat. "There remains the matter of the night at Ivy Cottage." His glance flicked to Nash. Mr. Nash produced a small immaculate card and placed it on the table as if it were a flower. "I came to ensure that certain names within the old trust were not printed in a vulgar list," he said. Mrs. Harrington's gesture, keeping this, suggested a temperament inclined to gestures. "I am engaged to prevent gestures from becoming headlines." "That is not nobility, Reverend. It is employment. I removed nothing because Miss Briggs returned too soon, and also because Miss Marple exists." Griselda made an involuntary sound that was almost a laugh. Len's mild eyes cooled. He disliked ethics done like bookkeeping. Miss Marple held the certificate so the lamplight touched the seal. "Thank you for not succeeding," she said. "One should not tidy living truth into dead order." Colonel Melchett straightened. Duty had found a path it could march. Mr. Godfrey, you will accompany Inspector Slack to Much Benham. Mr. Nash, you will keep yourself available. Mrs. Pike, Lydia, if you wish, I will see the registrar myself. There are forms for correcting certain records without cruelty. They will not change history, but they may keep malice from enjoying it. Thank you, Lydia said, not warmly. I prefer truth to kindness, but I will not scorn kindness when it behaves. Lionel still stood as if a blow had taught him the geography of rooms. He looked at Miss Marple with the nakedness boys have when men have not yet taught them poses. Did she die because of me? No, Miss Marple said. Because of men who are afraid of the wrong things. Slack made a gesture. Godfrey gave a small bow to the room, which was both apology and habit. On the threshold he turned back to Miss Marple. You said once that neatness excuses everything except grief. I believed grief to be a private failure. It seems it is a public debt. It is both, Miss Marple said. Pay what you can. They went and the house exhaled. Griselda set a cup where Lydia could ignore it with dignity. Mr. Nash, who understood exits, withdrew without fanfare. Colonel Melchett lingered for orders he would call common sense when he repeated them. Len murmured a blessing that was really permission to survive. When the door closed at last and the bells remained mercifully silent, Miss Marple and Lydia faced each other across the small table, as women who had each, in their different ways, kept houses standing in weather. I should like, Lydia said, in the tone of a woman reclaiming her mornings, to go home by the back lane. People will have found excuses to be on the front. Miss Marple rose and reached for her shawl. I will walk with you. The snow accepted them. The village had that attentive quiet which is really commentary. Windows were rectangles of inquiry. Cats performed indifference. The Green Man's sign creaked like a contented gossip. As they went, Lydia's stride lost its stiffness and settled into its usual authority. You will tell me plainly if there is any way for me to spare the choir from losing its leader, she said. Lionel has courage, but courage requires a roof. There are scholarships, Miss Marple said, and subscriptions. The village enjoys virtue when it can recognize it without effort. You will need only to permit them to be generous and not to despise the manner in which they do it. I despise nothing that keeps a boy in music, Lydia said, not even committees. At the gate of her cottage she paused. Miss Marple, Jane, what do people like us do in stories when the paper says what it says? We go on peeling potatoes, Miss Marple said. Can't we ask the vicar to explain blandly from the pulpit that charity loveth truth more than reputation? He will wrap it in Corinthians. People cannot quarrel with Corinthians at Christmas. Lydia's laugh surprised them both. It was a bright sound with iron under it. Very well, she said. We will be exemplary. It will annoy the right people. She kissed Miss Marple on the cheek with an awkward gratitude, like a queen practicing democracy, and went inside to light her fire. Miss Marple walked on alone. The village resumed its proper size. She passed the Bantry's gates where Dolly's wreath had been righted, and glanced with automatic tenderness at the window where Louise Harrington had looked out once with a fear that had become a decision. Human nature, she thought, so often tries to buy peace with secrecy and then discovers that the coin will not keep. Better to speak earlier. Best to be kind when others do. At home she set her knitting in order and found that she had dropped a stitch the size of a moral. She fetched it up with the quiet competence of a woman who knows that repair is not neatness but mercy, applied with a small hook. Presently Len arrived with news. Godfrey had made a full statement. The yard would take an interest. Mr. Nash had evaporated into phrases. Colonel Melchett, having hammered at the bank, had uncovered enough arithmetic to satisfy even Slack. And the village? She asked, not looking up from the wool. Len smiled. Divided between shock and recipes. Griselda is composing a rota for Lydia. I have been tasked with Corinthians. Choose the verse that minds its own business, Miss Marple advised. People like commandments better when they look like advice. After he left, she sat a little longer, letting the evening settle around her chair like an old shawl. The tree in the square would be lit tonight. The choir would manage. Somewhere Lionel would try his scales and find that breath and truth use the same muscles. Somewhere Lydia would discover that opening a window and drawing a curtain can sound the same if done briskly. And somewhere in rooms that thought themselves insulated by walnut and whispering, men like Mr. Nash would write their memoranda and leave out the one line that mattered, because kindness does not invoice well. When the hour came, she put on her coat and went to the green. The village gathered as villages do, shoulder to ordinary shoulder, drawn by custom more than cheer. The first carol sounded tentative, then held. Miss Marple watched faces soften as voices found one another. She saw Colonel Melchett nod to Lydia, and Lydia incline her head as if accepting a formal apology on behalf of Winter. She saw Lionel's throat work and the note come true. She saw, in a corner beyond the lamplight, a careful gentleman lift his hat and vanish as tidiness must when it is not wanted. Snow began again, small and unambitious, content to make clean edges. Miss Marple felt it light on her sleeve. It was, she thought, an honest Christmas after all, the sort people remember rightly or not at all. And because human nature will always produce its small tragedies with the holiday puddings, it had needed only a little observation to set the tray straight, retrieve a paper, and lay a soul's two halves side by side until they matched. She sang the next verse very softly, the words comfortably old, and thought, as she often did, that the world would be quite bearable if only people would stop trying to keep it tidy. The snow melted slowly from the hedgerows in the days that followed, leaving behind dark earth and the smell of wood smoke clinging to the lanes. The village, having gorged itself on speculation, now grew quiet, for the truth had emerged too plainly even for gossip to embroider. Julian Godfrey had given his statement in full, with a precision that seemed at once penitence and habit. He had admitted the method, confessed the motive, and accepted the consequence with a kind of weary relief, as though a lifetime of order had ended in the one disorder he could not correct. Inspector Slack, triumphant yet faintly bewildered, declared the case solved while Colonel Melchett shouldered the burden of official words. Mrs. Lydia Pike endured the revelation with a steel composure that impressed even her detractors. She walked daily to the church, head high, and faced the curious eyes of neighbors without flinching. It was understood that Lionel's place in the choir would be safeguarded. The village, fond of sentiment when it could be expressed cheaply, rallied to him with subscriptions and sympathy. In time, the boy's voice would rise clearer for having weathered storm. As for Clara Briggs, she remained at Ivy Cottage until arrangements could be made. She carried herself with subdued dignity, insisting that her mistress had been generous in her way, however entangled in her past. The house itself seemed emptied of its former menace, as though the truth had unlocked a shutter and let in air. No one doubted it would soon have a new tenant, and the tragedy, like others before it, would become part of St. Mary Mead's intricate memory. On Twelfth Night, the Bantrys hosted one last gathering, subdued but necessary. The tree was lit once more, the crackers pulled with a kind of deliberate defiance, and the talk was of plans for the coming year. Miss Marple sat among them, her knitting on her lap, smiling when spoken to and observing when she was not. To the casual eye she was the picture of harmless age, content to listen to trifles. Only a few knew that her mild presence had drawn together the scattered threads of betrayal, secrecy and greed, and tied them in a knot no man could untangle. Later, as Dolly Bantry walked her to the door, she whispered, "Jane, I don't know how you do it." "You see what no one else does," Miss Marple patted her arm. "It isn't cleverness, my dear. People behave very much the same, whether in a great city or a little village. One need only watch. Poor Mr. Godfrey thought he could put life into neat compartments, but human nature will always spill over the edges." She stepped out into the night, where the snow glittered faintly under the moon. The village lay hushed, its cottages warm, its secrets for now at rest. Miss Marple paused at her gate. listening to the distant sound of carols lingering from the church, and smiled to herself. There would be other Christmases, other dramas, other reminders that beneath the holly and the hymns, people remained what they had always been: fragile, proud, foolish, and sometimes cruel. But for this night at least, peace returned to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple drew her shawl more closely around her shoulders, went inside to her fire, and took up her knitting once more. The quiet click of needles keeping time with her thoughts. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly untidy, but it always revealed itself in the end, and that, she supposed, was the truest gift of Christmas, not the absence of sorrow but the comfort of understanding.